But I'm unsure if you've heard of that phrase before, but as the video seemingly endlessly explained, rot days are becoming increasingly popular on social media. But what are rot days? It is a cultural response, as the guy said, to a world that feels tired, overworked, and often overwhelmed. Now, I am 42 years old, so I'm officially an old, as I've been told. And as an old, my first instinct is to criticize that, right? To think of that's some lazy Gen Z millennial thing that these young people do. That's my instinct, right? Is all these lazy kids. But as Christians, we got to be better than that, right? We got to look for ways to connect with people, not disconnect. So I'm trying to follow the advice of the great philosopher Ted Lasso and be curious, not judgmental. So what's up with rot days? Is it just a bunch of young people being lazy, or is there something else going on here? And I think it points to something going on in our world. What that is that a lot of people feel like the world just isn't working. Most young people that I know work really hard at their jobs. They work really long hours. They're trying to make it all work. They're not lazy. And if I'm really honest with myself, the world that young people inhabit is in a lot of ways more complex and maybe even more challenging than the one I grew up in. I mean, if you've looked at the news, purchasing a home is getting more and more challenging. Wages aren't keeping up with inflation. There's this incredible pressure to be on the wrong side of history or support the wrong cause or say the wrong thing. It can be overwhelming. That funny feeling that Bo Burnham sang about is becoming more and more prevalent. It's no longer a funny feeling, it's becoming the dominant feeling for a lot of young people. And I bet if we fellow olds would take time to not judge, but instead talk about life and what's going on, I think most of us would say, yeah, that does sound like a lot. That does sound tiring. More often than we would say, well, yeah, that's just lazy. But as the video said, there are problems with rot days, with responding to being overwhelmed and tired and busy. There are problems with responding by just holing up in bed for a 24-hour period. It's not surprising, right? Our culture can oftentimes identify the broken parts of the world, but they're not always the best at coming up with solutions, right? Think about that word, rot, a rot day. Well, what do things that are rotten do? They die. When things are pulled out of their environment, like a plant, right? When you yank it out of its environment, they eventually rot away and perish. What the heart of a rot day is an ache for authentic rest. A rest that will provide not just relief, right? There's been many times where I've vegged out and watched way too much TV as a relief, but it's not healing. Rot day is aching for some sort of healing, some sort of rest. And that picture of true rest is precisely where we find ourselves this morning as we end our sermon series on Genesis chapter 1. Here we are at the end of the chapter. You'll see here in a minute how confusing that is. At the end of creation. Now, our sermon series has been a slow walk through the creation of the world in Genesis chapter 1, but the story actually wraps up at the beginning of Genesis chapter 2. And as with all things, we can blame the British for this. A man named Stephen Langton was a churchman who got out all the Bible. He got out the Bible with the printing press and all the things going on. He said this would be a good idea to divide this thing into chapters and verses. And he is the reason that we now have to go to Genesis chapter 2 to hear about the end of creation. So turn there with me, Genesis chapter 2, and let's see how God is going to wrap up this sermon series. Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work he had done. Here we are at the end of God's creative activity in the world. In the past 6 days, as we've been preaching for many months now, there's been a pattern. God has been forming space, and then he's been filling that space, right? So time, land, sea, animals. He's been doing forming and filling, forming and filling. And at the end of the sixth day, he creates these human beings that are supposed to be his image bearers and shepherd and care for all of creation. And then finally, here on this last day, we read that God rested from all that work. That word in your Bible, rest, is a Greek word, Shabbat. And in its most simple reading, it means this: stop. Just stop. Like when Mariah Carey, All I Want for Christmas, comes on the radio, you just want to stop, right? You just want it all to stop. Sometimes the holidays get crazy and busy. You look at your calendar, you look at everything, and you go, man, I just wish we could just stop for a moment. Can we just stop? And the way the Bible tells us that stop happened was a moment of rest. That strikes me as strange. Why does God, who is God, need to rest? He doesn't get tired. What's it mean for God to rest? Well, we've been talking about his creation work as a temple, right? God's been forming his temple. He's been filling it with animals and people and birds and tanin and all these other things. And now here on the seventh day, he's going to fill it with himself. He's going to now come into this temple and be there and be present. And the authors called that stopping, that in having the temple as rest. God stopped creating and he rested in his temple. Now, there's two other things to notice about this as you're reading it. First, it says that God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. Now, that word hallowed, your Bible might say holy. It means to set it apart. God set apart this seventh day as something special. What I find interesting about that is he didn't set apart the other days. He didn't say, these days are hallowed. Look at all the work I did. Look at how amazing it was. It was amazing. But he hallowed the seventh day because of rest. He didn't say, oh, this is a special day, I need to rest. No, he rested, and because he rested, he made it a special day. There's something going on here with rest. He rules and reigns from a place of rest. He wants to be with his creation. In particular, those image bearers that he made, he wants to rest. And that rest with them, he calls holy. The second thing to notice is if you've been with us, you know that every day kind of followed a pattern. At the end of all the days, it said, and there was evening and there was morning. But this day doesn't have that pattern. This day doesn't have the evening and morning cycle. What's going on here? Well, I think what the authors are trying to convey is that this is kind of like the eternal day. This is the default setting for this creation, that God is going to be in it, a part of it, with these image bearers, ruling and reigning throughout all eternity in rest. Now, that rest doesn't mean that they just did nothing. Remember the creation mandate that we learned about a couple weeks ago? God gave human beings stuff to do. Hey, be fruitful and multiply, as we talk about baby dedication. Go to the ends of the world, cultivate the land, shepherd all of this creation together. So it's not just not doing anything, but it's doing it in this restful posture. And I begin to think about that. Okay, what's it mean to create and then inhabit and enjoy and rest and still do stuff together? What does that look like? I thought two ways kind of came into my mind that kind of helped me think about that. One is found in one of my family's favorite Christmas memories. When I was 8 years old, I had the honor and privilege of unwrapping a Nintendo on Christmas Eve. The original old school Nintendo. Few of you human beings have words to express the utter joy of opening up an original Nintendo. Okay, there was nothing else. Okay, it was just Nintendo. And my mom to this day still says that was the most excited I think I have ever seen you in your life. Now I open that gift, I lay it, we lay it all out. And then what do? You get to work, right? So we're creating this Nintendo, right? We're putting it on top of the VCR. Some of you are like, okay. We're hooking up those little colored things in the back, which once again, some of you are like, what? Like there's color things? Yes, like red and yellow and then white, and you got to hook it all up. Or maybe the original one, you had to turn it to the right channel to get it to come onto the TV. So we did all this work, and then what did we do? We didn't just sit back and go, oh, that was great. Like, whew. No, we played it. We spent time together, me and my brother, hours upon hours upon hours of playing Tecmo Super Bowl and Mario, and just we spent so much time enjoying the work that my parents had done. And that's how we're made, to spend time with God in this beautiful place that He's created for us in rest. The second way to think about this, and maybe this is a better way to think about it, it's the holidays, so maybe you're going to have company come over, maybe family's coming in town. What do you do leading up to the family coming in town? Well, if you're in my house, you clean, right? You set things up. My wife is here this morning. It's like, you mean I clean? No, sorry. We work together to the best of my abilities to clean and do what? Create a space for these guests to come over and enjoy, right? So you're cleaning baseboards, you're making sure the beds are right, you're washing the sheets, you're cleaning the bathrooms. You're doing all this stuff to create a space for your guests to enjoy. And when they come over, what do? You don't say, hey, cool, glad you're here. Kind of help us keep cleaning and keep straightening up our house. No, you do what? You celebrate. You eat meals together. You enjoy all the work that you did to create this space. But there's also stuff to do, right? You still got to do the dishes, because you're going to eat more meals. So you're kind of working together, dependent on your family, in ways where you're having fun, right? Like washing the dishes together and laughing. And maybe your family's different. Maybe it's not always fun like that. But that's the ideal, that we create this space and we take time to enjoy it with the people we love. And when your guests leave, what do? You don't say, oh man, wasn't it so great when we fought that 2 hours before your parents got here and had that big argument and then had to act like it. Like, you don't do that. You just remember, like, oh my gosh, wasn't it fun when this happened? Or wasn't it great when our kid did this? Or that gift that your brother gave so-and-so, right? You just enjoy all the work and time together. And that's a picture of what Sabbath is. Now, I mentioned that maybe your family's not ideally like that. We know that's the case because, spoiler alert, a couple of chapters past this, we run into Genesis chapter 3, where the default is no longer working and reigning with God to enjoy His creation. There's still a lot of work to do, but now the default setting is marked by pain and division. But yet God still leaves this Sabbath as a marker for God's people to participate in. Now, other religions talk about rest, but none of them have a special day set aside to stop and to rest and to enjoy time with God and with one another. It became a marker of the people of God and a pattern. Look at Exodus 23 for a moment. Look how committed God is to not just giving people rest, but even the land itself. He says, for 6 years you shall sow the land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild animals may eat. You shall do the same with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, so that your ox and your donkey may have relief, and your homeborn slave and the resident alien may be refreshed. God really cares about this concept of rest for people, for animals, for even the very land we live on. It's so significant that God even has there's once a week a Sabbath, every 7th year there's a Sabbath, and there's also every seventh year a Sabbath. It's called the year of Jubilee. We sang a little bit about it this morning. And this was meant to be just like a total restoration, a total rest, a return to the original creation. God gives the details of this in Leviticus. And this is what he says. Leviticus, I'll read all of it. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Seems like there'd be an easier way to say that, but that's what he's got for us. And on that day, then you shall have the trumpet sounded loud. On the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement, you shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all your land. And you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return, every one of you, to your property, and every one of you to your family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow or weep the aftergrowth, or harvest the unpruned vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat only what the field itself produces. It's this pattern that keeps building and building of taking time to rest. And God cares about it so much that the prophets critique Israel over and over for not doing it, for not resting, for not returning the land. The people of God refused to enter into this rest. They refused to be these image bearers who are reflecting God's care out into the world. And instead, they started reflecting the world back to the world. The image began to fade. Instead of giving people rest, they demanded more work, more produce. Instead of practicing this year of Jubilee, they continued to build systems where rich people could buy more land and get more money, and poor people could get more and more pushed out to the margins. They reflected the world around them instead of reflecting this original creation that God had in mind, where the whole world is a place where all humans can thrive. And when the people of God practice Sabbath, it does that. And it does that in two unique ways. When we Sabbath, when we take time to rest, it does two things. It confronts and it conflicts. Let's take a look at the first one. Sabbath is a confrontation. It confronts. One of the things it does when we take time to simply stop and rest, it confronts our individual and our cultural idols. We are individuals, yes, and we're individuals who come together and build systems and build ways in which the world works. And the world that we are building, I think one way to explain it or describe it is that it is always on. There's always something going on. It's always on. And as that technology advances more and more, it challenges, it encourages, it forces us in a lot of ways to keep up with the onness by always being on ourselves. Stores are open 24 hours a day. Amazon will get you the package tomorrow. You got to pay attention to this advertisement because you can't miss this deal. You can't miss this experience. You got to keep the phone next to you in case your buddy in the group chat has a funny joke or you get an invite to the thing. You don't want to miss it. You're always like one click away from work, just like, oh, I can move the ball down the field. Like, I can move that project 2 more steps forward. Just give me 10 minutes to do this thing really fast. It puts us in this cycle of being on at all times. And yes, some of that is great. I'm glad I can go to Walgreens at 11 o'clock at night and get medicine if my kid gets sick. But most of it, I just want to say, can we just stop? What does being on like that all the time produce, right? It produces a culture that prioritizes things like money and status and stuff. But when you Sabbath, you confront those things and you say, no, what's important is rest, relationships, celebrating, being with one another. Sabbath confronts those like cultural idols, but it also confronts our individual idols that we hold dear. I mean, almost everyone you talk to, right? If you ask them, how you doing? What's going on in your world? You already know what I'm about to say. What do we reply with? I'm just so busy. Now, judge not lest you be judged. I literally just did this morning. Dennis Ellis, we're having a conversation. What's going on? Well, busy, got a lot going on, right? We wear it as some kind of like strange badge of like, hey, look how busy I am. I must be important. I got so much going on that I'm so valuable. It kind of produces these values in us as individuals. Tim Chester is a pastor in England, so I guess we can't blame the British for everything. But he wrote a great book, a great title called The Busy Christian's Guide to Busyness. And he lays out 6 lies that we often believe that keep us busy. When we say like, oh, I'm busy, I got so much going on. And when we look at someone who's maybe, when they say they're not busy, we're like, well, what do you mean you're not busy? Like, are you not working hard? Are you not da-da-da? And he says, these are some of the lies that keep us busy, right? We need to prove ourselves. Well, we got to be busy because other people have expectations of us. Well, if I don't do this or that, things get out of control. Well, I actually prefer being under pressure. I need to make more money. I want to make the most of my life. And if we slowed down, we would probably find that many of us are believing some of these lies. We might have even said these things. I remember a time in my life where I worked too much, like super busy. You know, I was single for most of my 20s, so what else am I going to do, right? Like, I got time. So just work. And if you would have asked me, oh, man, you know, I'm just doing this for the glory of God as a pastor, like, you know, no glory to me, all praise to God. But deep under all that was selfishness, yeah, maybe if I do this or that, I'll get recognized by this, or maybe I can get this job, or maybe I can be this kind of person or this kind of pastor. Maybe people will listen to me. Just ugly. And the reality is, you lie and tell yourself, well, I'll slow down once blank happens. The blank never comes. When we Sabbath, we confront those idols that our culture tells us and also the lies we tell ourselves about our busyness and how we spend our time. But the Sabbath isn't just about confrontation. It's also an incredible gift God has given us. We talked about Sabbath in the Old Testament, people of God. What about the life of Jesus? Does he say much about the Sabbath? Well, he absolutely does. And in 2 places in particular, Jesus talks about the true purpose of this first day, or this seventh day, this rest. Jesus, and one time in the book of Mark, chapter 2, he's walking through the fields with his disciples, and they're plucking grain because they're hungry. And this would have been breaking the Sabbath, right? This would have been, quote unquote, work. So as they're doing this, some of religious Pharisees come up and they're angry at Jesus, and they say, hey, why are y'all breaking the Sabbath? You're not following the rule. And Jesus reminds them of a story of David and a priest in the Old Testament. And Jesus turns to them and he says, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. What is he saying? He's saying the Sabbath is a gift. The Sabbath is a mercy for human beings. Which is why the next story is him healing a man on the Sabbath. Sabbath isn't about keeping rules. Sabbath is about mercy for people who are tired and overwhelmed and hungry. Jesus says that's what the Sabbath is for. Sabbath was for mankind. We think the opposite, right? We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But Sabbath is for us, for our rest. Jesus talks about rest in a few places. In particular, one of my favorite verses in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 11, Jesus says this, come to me, all of you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Rest for your souls. Physical rest, awesome. A 24-hour period where you just get to kind of rest and shut down the engine and slow your body down. Beautiful, yes, but also rest for your soul, for every part of you. That sounds like an incredible comfort to me. 24 hours of just rest. But there's a caveat here. Jesus says, you'll find rest if you come to me. If you follow Jesus, let me just ask you a real question right here, just a practical question. How do you practically come to Jesus? Is this just like a mental thing? Jesus is like, well, come to me when you're 8 years old and walk down the aisle and submit your life to me, and you'll find rest for the rest of your days. Maybe that's part of it. But practically, how do you do that every week? How do you come to Jesus to find this rest? I cannot think of a better way to do that than a 24-hour period where you just rest from your labor and enjoy relationships with those around you. You spend special time with Him. A 24-hour period where you know there's nothing on the calendar today except worship and rest. That sounds like an enormous source of comfort to people in our world who feel tired, lonely, and burnt out. I thought about Sabbathing this week. I've been trying to do this for about 8 years since I kind of worked in seminary to create a rule of life, a way to kind of structure my life around God, and not great at it. But I've been reminded, physician, heal thyself, as I was talking with my wife, and I was like, yeah, we're talking about Sabbath. And she just honestly, lovingly, some people say it sarcastically, reminded me that I haven't taken my Sabbath the past couple of weeks. Been running around doing stuff, good stuff, but I haven't been resting. It's hard to do. It's a hard practice to learn. But I thought about this as I was reflecting on Sabbath and what might be different in my life if I really committed to doing this. And I thought about my kids. And honestly, I thought about the young adult or the youth at Rooftop, and you young adults too, sure. But I'm thinking about my two daughters, and I can't imagine how comforted, how confident, how loved my kids might grow up to be if once a week I cleared out my schedule and said, let's just rest. Let me show you how to rest. Let me show you how to spend time with each other. Nothing else going on. I'm here for you 24 hours a day. I'm just here to rest. How many conversations would we have about life, about challenges, about what's going on? How much laughter, how much good food if we just took this time to do this with our people, especially our kids, especially youth who feel a little lonely, a little disconnected. How much would things change by doing something as simple as taking time to rest? So how do we do that? Okay, let's get to the brass tacks here. How can we start taking steps towards rest? It's going to be a challenge. It is going to be a challenge. I'm still challenged by it. I'm always trying to think of new things to add or how can I do this better? Let me give you 3 tips really quickly as we wrap up our time. First, 2 things you got to think about when you're planning out your Sabbath, your resting, is to focus on 2 things, worship and rest. Let that be your guiding question. Will this activity that I have planned cause me to worship or to rest? If the answer is no, don't do it. That means something's got to get pushed out. All right? That means you can't watch 8 hours of Netflix and then say, whew, I rested. That's not connecting with God. That's not connecting with those around you. You can't be checking your fantasy football team constantly and being disappointed because that guy didn't score a touchdown on that play. You can't be distracted by football and yelling and screaming at the TV. Okay, maybe I'm just preaching to myself here. You got to be present with God and present with those around you. You have to avoid challenging conversations sometimes. There's 6 other days to talk about all the stuff that's got to get fixed, all the work that's got to get done. I get it. It's a challenge. But you got to avoid that. You got to say, this is just a day of rest and worship. Bring other people into it. But you got to be careful, okay? Only bring people who are going to help you rest. Think about the person that you want to invite over where you know you don't have to get up and clean the house, right? Where you can just wear your PJs and not feel like you got to be on. Those are the kind of people you want to spend your time around in worship or rest. We don't have to be... Secondly, let's start small. You are not going to wake up tomorrow and say, all right, 24-hour period, I'm not going to do nothing but rest and worship. It's a really hard... The world has taught us not to do that, and they're really good at it. So we got to start small. Some of you work every day of the week. Some of you work on Sundays. So it's not this thing where you got to, all right, I got to do it on this certain day. Let's start small. Let's try to find 3 hours. Can you find 3 hours next week where you can intentionally set aside all the stuff going on in your life to rest and worship? Let me give you a quick template, all right? Let's just say Sunday. Go worship God. Go worship God somewhere. That's 1 hour. Depending on who's preaching, as I see the timer click red and tell me to slow down, or not slow down, speed up. But go to worship for 1 hour. Then take an intentional lunch after that. Maybe you want to invite someone along that you enjoy, that's going to help you just relax and enjoy life. Go to lunch for 1 hour. And then after lunch, get home and maybe just go for a walk. Or maybe don't go home, drive straight to the park and just walk. Now, you might look at me and go, none of that sounds restful. Okay? All right. Figure that out. Experiment. We have freedom. Then finally, and maybe most importantly, you got to have a correct view of what the Sabbath is. Remember, Jesus says the Sabbath is for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. What did he mean by that? He meant you got to fight the temptation to be a Pharisee and see the Sabbath as this legalistic, like, oh my gosh, okay, I got to do this or God's going to smite me, or he's going to be angry, he's going to be mad if I don't take this rest. This is just another thing I got to add on to my busy schedule. You got to fight the temptation to see that, but to see it as a thing of healing, a gift given. Instead of just disconnecting and dying, see Sabbath as, okay, I'm going to find real honest rest here, because Sabbath will connect you with the source of life, God himself. See, that's the problem with rot days. Rot days are just you in bed. You're not the source of life, but God can give you life. Finally, here's the best way to think about the Sabbath. The Sabbath is God as a good father calling you during the week and saying, hey, I know you're busy. I know you got a lot going on, a lot of good stuff. You're working hard, but could we just set aside some time to just be together? Once you come over to the house, I've cleaned it up, I've prepared it, I've got it all ready. Wear your PJs and just sit for a minute and just relax. That's what God is offering you in Sabbath. Now, I just assume that's all your default thoughts about who God is, right? Like you all think of God as that way, a loving father who just wants to spend time with you. You don't see him as this tyrant who's holding the holy stopwatch, like making sure you're clocking in and out at the right time, or calling you to tell you that he's disappointed because you don't call him enough or because you don't visit enough. If that's how you see God, man, scrap all that. Scrap all that and see God as Jesus did, as a loving father who on this final day of creation created a space for us to be with him. The band's coming up to play a song, Jason's coming to play a song, and this is the Sunday where we pray together. So there's going to be some people come down to the front. We're going to sing a song. We're going to create a space for you to engage with God. And maybe you come to him now. What are those barriers? What are those things that keep you from resting? What are maybe those visions of God in your brain that say, man, I don't even want to spend time with myself. Like, no one wants to spend time with me. Wait, you tell me there's a God who wants to do that? Maybe you've got a lot coming up in your life this week and you need real prayer. So let's do this. Let's stand to our feet. I'm going to pray over you. Jason's going to sing a song. And then if you want prayer, there'll be some people up front. We would love to pray with you. If you can't make it to the front, I want to encourage you to pray where you're at. Come to God, even in this moment, asking for rest. Let me pray. Lord, this is time when we're setting apart a couple minutes to rest, to try to quiet our minds and see you as a God who wants to give us rest. Will you help us now as we sing and as we pray? Be with us. In Jesus' name, amen.